broke into a hearty laugh and held up a hand. "Excuse me," he said, "but I've got this friend. He's blind, and he's a dirty old man like myself. And what he does when he'll be talking to a young girl is he'll ask her if he can put his hands on her face, feel the way she looks, so he can get a picture of her. And what happens is the girls always say yes, sure, go ahead, every time. They find it, hey, touching, I guess. I never thought of it that way before, but I guess that's what it is. It's real sensitive, and that appeals to them. And I've seen him do this, and you should see the girls. I mean, they really get off on it. They're smiling, doing this great thing for him, and they're practically glowing. It's just about beatific. And then what he does is he heads a little bit south, down the neck and shoulders, and I'll leave the rest of it up to your imagination. But he says he makes out pretty well. So what I'm trying to say is that there are problems and compensations, if you know how to find them. Behind them on the small stage, a black man came out, an older man with salt and pepper hair, a big guy. "You know who this is?" Mike said. Kevin shook his head. "Falling Wall James," said Mike. "Falling Wall?" said Kevin. Mike nodded. "He plays the blues." Kevin thought Falling Wall was a funny thing to call yourself. It sounded like an Indian name, like Laughing Waters or Broken Arrow. Broken Arrow made him think of Broken Heart. Listening to Mike, he'd forgotten about his girl. Falling Wall James sat down at a piano and began to play. When he was done with a song, he'd tell a little story, and then he'd play another. His stories were about being thrown out of the house, unable to pay his bills, out of work, out of luck, misconstrued by another woman. They were all sad stories, but the way Falling Wall told them, they seemed funny, and the songs seemed filled with joy, too. Kevin had trouble really listening, though, because he was thinking about his girl again and wondering what she was doing while he sat there with a cripple listening to an old black guy play the blues. When Falling Wall finished his set, he stood up and the whole bar burst into cheers. He smiled and waved, showing big yellow teeth and a pink tongue. Then he stepped down off the stage and sat right next to Kevin. Kevin could smell the full, pungent heat of the big man. "Wall, this is Kevin," said Mike. "Kevin, this is Falling Wall James. I'm his biggest fan." Falling Wall laughed, showing his teeth and tongue again. "That's because you knows," he says. "You been there, you been around." "The way you play, everybody understands," said Mike. "So long as they got feelings," said Falling Wall. "So long as they livin' in the world. But everybody don't dig it, no sir. There's many who don't understands. You got to dig way down deep before you hit the blues." Falling Wall stayed for a while, and he and Mike talked. Then he excused himself and went to the bar to get a beer. Kevin asked Mike how he knew the singer, and Mike told him he'd seen a report on TV about him, and he wanted to hear him, so he found out where he played and came to see him. And then Mike said, "He knows all about the happiness inside the sorrow. I needed to hear that at the time." Kevin didn't say anything. After a while, Falling Wall James got back up on the stage and began to sing again. Kevin looked at Mike during one of the songs, and the look on his face was just like the look he described on the faces of the girls with the blind man, almost glowing. And Kevin wondered if Mike might not be faking it, like the blind man he told him about. A crazy thought came into his head. Under the table, he put his foot on Mike's and pressed down hard. The expression on Mike's face did not change. There was a fork on the table, off to the side, where someone else must have been eating. Kevin palmed the fork, reached under the table, and pressed the tongs into one of Mike's legs, hard, then harder. The expression on Mike's face did not change. He was still smiling radiantly, listening to Falling Wall James. Tears suddenly sprang into Kevin's eyes, from a remarkable combination, in part out of pity for Mike because he could not feel anything, and partly out of envy because he could.